Hello and welcome everyone. I am Rachel Paul with IAAP and thank you for joining us today. Hope your Wednesday is going well. Before we get started, just a few items to go over. Everyone's microphone is muted just to prevent any background noise or distractions. Closed captioning is available. You can select the closed captioning icon. It should be at the bottom of your screen in the toolbar so you can see the subtitles. We will have time for questions today at the end of today's presentation, but throughout the session, as questions come up, please feel free to leave your questions in the chat or in the Q&A box, and so we'll get to those at the end. And today's webinar will be recorded and made available to all registrants afterwards, as well as a copy of today's presentation. So I'm happy today to have Kathryn Weber-Hottleman with us today from the University of Connecticut. And so I'm going to turn it over to Kathryn to get started. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rachel. So welcome everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today for our presentation on the forest and the trees, scaling for enterprise level digital accessibility. I'm Kathryn Weber-Hottleman. I'm the IT Accessibility Coordinator at the University of Connecticut. Which means that my responsibilities extend over the entire university and our vast digital landscape. So we're going to talk about not only what it looks like to develop an accessibility plan from a really high level, but we're also going to get down into some of the nitty-gritty of actual testing and what it looks like to be kind of the on-the-ground person for accessibility. All right, so I'm just going to share my screen. So today's agenda, we'll talk a little bit about, we'll give an overview of what it looks like to have digital accessibility considerations. I'll give some background, which really talks about a lot of the legal cases and dear colleague letters that have come up in the past few years. We'll talk about how to design an ICT accessibility plan or an information and communication technology accessibility plan, which of course includes accessibility testing and stakeholders, and then we'll do some takeaways at the end. So let's get started. As technology increasingly infuses daily life, it has become necessary to regulate its accessibility. The purpose of civil rights laws governing accessibility is to ensure that all people, regardless of race, sex, disability, or any other aspect of identity, have equal opportunities to participate in every facet of life. Specific laws such as the Americans with Disabilities Act, or the ADA, and Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973 make specific provisions for people with disabilities. And then in January of 2018, the US formally adopted the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines version 2.0, also known as WCAG 2.0, as its information and communication technology accessibility standard. And these guidelines were appended to Section 508 of the Rehabilitation Act. This amendment, combined with dear colleague letters and case precedent, has introduced this question of how organizations, whether federal, state, public, or private, can adhere to this standard. So a developed action plan, and in many cases, someone to implement these strategies in the plan, are effective steps towards compliance and adoption. Keep in mind as we go through a lot of this that the new Section 508 standards only apply to federal agencies and offices, not to other organizations. But the dear colleague letters issued by the Department of Justice and the Office for Civil Rights in 2010 and 2011 make it abundantly clear that organizations such as higher education institutions and companies are held to similarly rigorous standards. The Dear Colleague Letters guidance was borne out in cases against the University of California at Berkeley, Harvard and MIT, and Miami University of Ohio. Numerous other institutions also received notice of complaints filed with OCR and entered into resolution agreements. So drawing on these precedents, an organization's proactive plan involves steps for evaluating current accessibility levels, remediating issues, and positioning for future ICT accessibility. So the key idea that I really want people to take away from this is that you need a proactive plan. And a proactive plan has a few key components. So first, you need to evaluate your current accessibility levels. You can't possibly make a plan if you don't know where you're starting. Then you'll need to think about how you're going to remediate issues. So taking things that are inaccessible and making them more accessible, hopefully making them fully accessible. So that's kind of looking backwards. And then the proactive piece of this is positioning for future ICT accessibility. So wrapping ICT accessibility into the procurement process and getting the word out about ICT accessibility. You'll want to work closely with template designers so that out-of-the-box templates are accessible. And you'll also want to work with different departments, designers, and developers on remediation. If you're at a big organization that has multiple IT groups, this is going to be particularly important for you to make sure that accessibility is getting wrapped into their redesign process and their initial design process. All right, so what do we do first? An initial step towards addressing ICT accessibility issues is often to issue internal guidance, typically in the form of a policy or policies. At UConn, the ICT accessibility policy, along with the providing information in alternative formats policy, and the policy against discrimination, harassment, and related interpersonal violence, lends weight to practical recommendations. So the policy is supported by best practices, tutorials, and other similar supports to guide content stewards as they're actually enacting the policy. The guidance is really specific. It draws on WCAG 2.0 AA standards. So WCAG has 3 different levels, A, AA, and AAA. We've seen from case precedent that organizations tend to be held to 2.0 or 2.1 AA. UConn has also developed marketing best practices and adapted social media best practices for accessibility, and that works in tandem with UConn's brand standards for accessibility, the non-discrimination policy, and the alternative formats policy. So another step towards ICT accessibility is identifying compliance issues. Often, this begins with the assessment of websites and related materials. Assessing newly created websites is perhaps the easier portion of the task because safeguards can be added into the development process. For example, at UConn, we have a request form that must be completed for a site to become live, and the form specifically asks about accessibility, reminding developers to review the ICT accessibility policy and to measure the new site against its standards. Websites based out of Aurora, UConn's instance of WordPress, also have a feature in which images lacking alternative text are grayed out, appearing faded to an unusable point and clearly marking them as inaccessible. In addition, developers have the opportunity to use tools on the IT accessibility website, which is a resource with guidance on creating accessible websites and associated content, as well as tools for monitoring accessibility throughout development. So the task of testing existing websites can be a lot more daunting. Existing websites were developed under a variety of standards, and there was and is a lot of freedom to modify templates. This, coupled with the sheer number of websites, makes accessibility assessment overwhelming and necessitates prioritization. So we use 4 primary criteria for establishing a site's priority for testing. The criteria are the number of users, the audience direction, the transactional nature of the website, and the frequency with which students with disabilities use the site. If a site has high traffic, like UConn's athletics site, it's highly prioritized. A site that draws a high amount of traffic from outside the UConn community, such as UConn's Jorgensen Center for the Performing Arts, is also considered a top priority. Transactional sites also draw attention, such as UConn's Connecticut Repertory Theater site, because patrons contract business there. Finally, sites used regularly by students with disabilities, such as the MyAccess portal from the Center for Students with Disabilities, are of high importance. UConn's starting point for testing existing websites is where these criteria intersect. However, because new sites are always developing and old sites are being refreshed, the accessibility testing schedule refreshes frequently. A new site meeting multiple criteria might trump an older site that meets only one criterion. Also, if a site is scheduled for major updates, there's no sense in reviewing it prior to the update, even if the site is high priority. An example is the Center for Students with Disabilities site, which, though high priority, recently underwent a major update. So we considered accessibility throughout the new site's construction, and we tested for accessibility during the development phase. So you're probably wondering what we actually do about non-website ICT, like hardware and software. We test that on an ad hoc basis. As a program or product comes under review for purchase or contract renewal, the same criteria determine its priority. For example, a campus-wide product must have accessibility considered during the request for proposals process, while a program used by one or two individuals in a single department should consider accessibility. We're going to talk about that further in the procurement section of this presentation. So there are a lot of ways that you can assess a website's accessibility. Automated checkers unearth general issues on a site. Some checkers are free, like Andy by the Social Security Administration, while others require a subscription. Automated checkers only touch the surface of compliance testing though, and they have to be supplemented by manual testing. One manual method, the trusted tester method, is the culmination of the Department of Homeland Security's trusted tester program. Other methods taught by programs like WebAIM's accessibility training or the Disability Resources and Educational Services IT Accessibility Badging Program out of the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign follow similar procedures. We are going to focus on the trusted tester method because that is the training that I went through. Okay. So the trusted tester method uses a free tool called Andy, the Accessible Name and Description Inspector. This tool is free and it was developed by the Social Security Administration. Andy allows users to look into a site's code and analyzes it in bite-sized pieces according to element type. For example, all images can be viewed and their alternate text evaluated with just a few clicks. Andy is fully keyboard accessible, and it has a feature called Andy Output, where Andy shows how a screen reader would likely interpret the selected element. The trusted tester method supplements Andy's color contrast tools with Color Contrast Analyzer by the Paciello Group and Color Contrast PAL, both of which are free. Additional testing tools include screen readers like NVDA or JAWS. One cautionary note about using screen readers as testing tools, though. Some screen readers, like JAWS, are structured in a way that they can rework code into its most accessible format, which means that they can frequently reconfigure digital content that's not accessible by design and read it as though it was accessible. Because of this, it's not an accurate indicator of a site's accessibility. We recommend first testing content according to the method of choice, and then using a simple free screen reader like NVDA to check inferred reading order and semantics. Our rule of thumb is to design sites in such a way that someone using a public computer and using the operating system screen reader for the first time can easily navigate the site. So we use the following process to identify accessibility issues and to communicate them to relevant staff. So we test a website's pages, applications, and content. For each page, a report is generated using a template provided by the Trusted Tested program. This information is compiled into a summary report with issues based on who owns the content or object in question. And I apologize, my slide's a little out of date here. We used to rely on Jim Thatcher's favorites, as well as Java Ferreter Access Bridge Explorer for Java, AI Inspect, and of course the color contrast analyzers. Right now, we've kind of reduced this list to be primarily Andy and Contrast Checker and Color Contrast PAL, where the others have been deprecated a little bit just because of Andy's great capabilities. So getting back to the summary report, I designed this by adapting the Trusted Tester report template for greater readability because it's a highly technical report and not everybody needs the full technical information. So in the summary report, we break information down into 3 categories: template, site-specific information, and content author information. So at UConn, web development and design is typically handled by information technology services, by designated staff in a given department, or by a third-party vendor, while many people may contribute content to a site. By categorizing the report results, individuals and departments can determine what remediation can be effected in-house and what needs to be addressed by the web development and design staff. Many UConn sites are deployed using Aurora templates, which means that not all remediation can be done by individuals or departments, but instead needs to be referred to ITS. However, templates are often customized, either by the ITS web development and design team or by a department or individual. These site-specific theme issues may need to be directed to ITS, or they could be addressed within a department. Content issues are the responsibility of the content author, so anybody who's able to modify content on a given website. So in addition to dividing up responsibility, UConn's template also provides space for a potential solution and rationale. Solutions are broad suggestions in line with WCAG 2.1 AA, and rationales share how the issue could impact users with disabilities. So both of these solutions and rationales are drawn from another UConn template. Once the report's actually written, it's distributed to the relevant staff. ITS is usually involved for template and or site-specific issues. The department that owns the site will naturally receive a copy of the report as well, as it will have to remediate content issues and potentially site-specific issues. If the site was developed by a vendor, however, the department will likely need to contact the vendor for template issues. But occasionally, depending on the department staff's level of technical expertise, the report might be condensed to target low-hanging fruit. This decision is made based on considerations such as the staff's level of coding experience and vendor involvement. Accompanying the report is always an invitation to meet with me and to tailor solutions to that individual or department's needs. Because websites have a variety of goals in addition to accessibility, it's really necessary to customize the remediation plan to integrate with the website's objectives. So the meetings help to clarify areas of responsibility as well as to really target the goals of the site. All right, so how do we go about remediating compliance issues? A big part of remediating accessibility issues is training developers and content authors. That doesn't mean you have to build the training from scratch necessarily. You can build it onto pre-existing training. For example, at UConn, we have training for Blackboard, which is their LMS, and Aurora. They both have accessibility training folded into them. It's also possible to customize existing third-party training with permission, of course. WebAIM, the W3C, Section 508 Playbook, and vendors like Free Play Media and Blackboard all offer accessibility training. We choose to develop our training in-house. I did a lot of research as we were preparing the training to really try to get at all of the different aspects of website accessibility. And I found that really 3 trainings need to be developed, each targeting different content stewards. So you want to target the average content author, procurement, and IT. Content author training is basic and non-technical, and it focuses on quick and easy fixes. Techniques from this training can be applied to a learning management system or to web content. Procurement training is more in-depth, focusing on questions to ask vendors and contractors. And we recently launched our procurement training. One discussion with procurement is always about the timing for introducing accessibility into conversations with a vendor. Finally, IT training is highly technical, and it needs to be updated regularly to reflect changes in standards and in code. It's focused on code and template development, and discussions for us include checking third-party widgets and plugins for accessibility. They also potentially involve discussions around involving the vendor with remediation strategies if a third-party solution is under consideration. For example, we've historically submitted tickets to vendors regarding compliance issues. So what's my actual job? It's my responsibility as the IT accessibility coordinator, not only to draft the action plan, but to also implement it. I set priorities for us, I determine areas of responsibility, and I have a system for monitoring accessibility. That means I have to be really mindful of the sustainability and scalability of the action plan. Another piece of my role is to build relationships with stakeholders. I'm responsible for allotting remediation tasks and for creating a global sense of teamwork. This enterprise level sense of supporting each other and working together is really critical to develop an accessibility culture at an organization. So if you're in the process of hiring an accessibility coordinator, these are some qualifications that, in my opinion, can be really helpful for that person as they step into this new role. Major caveat that a lot is learned on the job, because ICT accessibility is a constantly evolving field. I'd recommend that your IT accessibility coordinator goes through training in accessibility testing, preferably through a recognized program like the Trusted Tester program. Additional certifications like the CPAC and the WASP, which are offered through the IAAP, are also helpful for establishing credibility. It's also really necessary for your IT accessibility coordinator to have a thorough understanding of the ADA, sections 504 and 508, state accessibility laws, and WCAG 2.0 and 2.1. Experience applying these laws and guidelines in a disability services office or in an office of institutional equity, like if you were an ADA coordinator. That's also really helpful. Furthermore, familiarity with web development and design is helpful for proposing solutions and discussing accessibility standards with IT teams. Finally, your IT accessibility coordinator will need a strong sense of collaboration, but also a high level of independence. They're likely to intersect with many departments, but to primarily work on their own, especially if this is a new position to you. You won't likely have an accessibility team yet. However, the flexibility that this provides the IT accessibility coordinator allows them to strategically build relationships and kind of form their own team. So again, if you are introducing this position to your organization, there are a lot of places where the IT accessibility coordinator could be placed, like in disability services, in IT, in the Office of Institutional Equity or Compliance, in another department altogether. At UConn, I happen to be housed in our Information and Technology Services. There are a few advantages to this. First, it gives me a more universal role, and this is clearly demonstrated because UConn's ITS serves the entire institution. It also minimizes preconceived ideas about my role, which might not be the case if I was situated in the Disability Services Office or in our Office of Institutional Equity or Compliance. ITS also affords me many resources, departmentally and in the form of professional development opportunities. And finally, I get to focus solely on ICT accessibility without the responsibility of the caseload, which I might have if I was in the Disability Services Office. Now, there's going to be some challenges. For us, there was a steep learning curve, both for me about ITS and vice versa. I hadn't worked in IT before, and it was the academic side of the house in higher education is a very different experience from the student affairs side of things. So when I got to ITS, I could see that accessibility was obviously included through the design and development processes of all of our solutions, including LMS design. But web development and design teams don't typically spend months on in-depth research regarding web accessibility standards and changing regulations. Now that's my role, to be the expert on that. Conversely, web development and design were part of my training, but they weren't a focus. And then because this was a new position for UConn, a lot of flexibility was required both from the university leadership and from me. So frequent input from ITS leadership and from stakeholders around campus has really helped shape priorities, our accessibility timeline, and expectations. So in return, I incorporate as many priorities and adjust our timeline as necessary. So regardless of where I'm housed, though, there's a lot to learn as the organization and I work together. ICT accessibility isn't just my responsibility. It also requires support from top-level leadership to make it a priority and to infuse it into the organization's culture. Perhaps the best situation I find is when the organization has already identified accessibility as an issue, and then someone like me can present possible solutions and training. There are quite a few stakeholders in the institutional accessibility realm. I like to think of them as two groups, the visionaries and the realizers. So the visionaries shape an organization's direction and are responsible for top-down decisions. They also govern policies at the organization. It's likely if you are introducing an IT accessibility coordinator position that position came about as a result of the visionaries. The realizers are the hands-on problem solvers. They're the ones who enact remediation changes and carry out policies. They're also likely to work with your IT accessibility coordinator on a daily basis and will often be a sounding board for concerns or proposed solutions. Both groups have to work together, though, to achieve the broad goal of an accessibility culture across the entire organization. Without the buy-in of leadership, there's no official sanction for accessibility changes. And without the support of realizers, there are no concrete solutions. So they have to work together to promote an institutional mindset where accessibility is a standard initial consideration for any ICT that's created or purchased. So who are our stakeholders? There are a lot of stakeholders besides procurement included in the question of procuring accessible ICT. Besides procurement, we also have ITS, which is where I'm situated. The compliance office and disability services offices may also be pertinent, depending on where the intended use of the solution or service is requested. And finally, the department requesting or purchasing the ICT is involved naturally. Working with procurement guides all requests for ICT to consider accessibility and to really think about that in terms of institution-wide purchases. So I prioritize requested solutions and services based on the following criteria in terms of reviewing them for accessibility. I use kind of a heat map, considering the solution's costs and the number of the solution's users. As both costs and number of users increase, the priority increases. So by these criteria, enterprise level products will always be a top priority. A solution that's going to be used by one individual or department might be a lower priority. Another criterion is that student or public use will always be prioritized. If the solution is necessary for a student or a member of the broader community to engage with UConn, then it must be an accessible product. Third, solutions essential for class or work are prioritized over non-essentials for similar reasons. And finally, transactional solutions are prioritized over non-transactional solutions. For example, ticketing systems like those used by IT and athletics are prioritized over non-transactional sites. So it's very similar to how websites are prioritized for testing. So why do we actually involve accessibility in the procurement process? Well, discussions with procurement raise questions about accessibility for the requesting department to consider. Incorporating accessibility questions into these initial discussions potentially alleviates the stress of having to remediate products, websites, and other ICT for accessibility. So in this regard, it's financially responsible because it costs time and money to remediate, which can be detrimental to end users. For example, a vendor might not make changes quickly enough to actually help a student, or it might not remediate changes without additional cost. Proactivity also furthers the campus culture of accessibility, where ICT accessibility is not an afterthought, but is built in from the beginning of UConn's relationship with a solution or a vendor. In order to actually accomplish this, a lot of other people need to be able to evaluate a product's accessibility, at least on a high level. Training on how to read documents like a VPAT, a voluntary product accessibility template, is available through the W3C and through WebAIM, as well as through vendors like Site Improve Academy. In-house training has also been developed directing departments to ask questions about a VPAT. Training and discussions cause departments to think critically about accessibility and to recognize the needs of users with disabilities. There are limitations to this process. One limitation is the amount of time required to thoroughly test a product. That can take several days if you're able to focus on just testing, but when you have all your other responsibilities, it can take a week or longer. And then if an organization can't provide additional resources, such as student workers, to shoulder some of the testing load, it's likely that your IT accessibility coordinator could become a bottleneck for the procurement process. A potential solution, of course, is to test products after purchasing them. The drawback here is that the solution may be found to be inaccessible, despite good faith efforts of departments of procurement to ascertain its accessibility. Without expertise and work focus, it's highly possible that an accessible product may still be purchased. So how does this actually affect an organization's day-to-day operations? At UConn, web development and design and our LMS development now all consider accessibility. Content authors and stewards have begun to ask themselves about a page's accessibility or about captioning videos. Procurement has begun to involve me on enterprise-level solution discussions, and departments have begun earmarking funds for accessibility-related tools and features. As an institution, I'm pleased to say that UConn is shifting towards a culture where accessibility is not only embraced, but worked into the fabric of its operations. Reflecting on the significant changes I've seen in the 3 years that I've been at UConn, I've noted that the majority of the time, people only lacked tools to engineer accessibility. The mindset was there and the conversations were already happening, but no one knew how to standardize the testing process or establish a repository of solutions. So given these tools, I'm seeing that the organization is moving rapidly to a place where all users can experience UConn. So I'd love to take some questions now if anybody has any questions.
This is Rachel. I'm just checking. I don't see any questions in the chat or the Q&A. We can give a second here if anybody would like to take a minute.
Yeah, Kathryn, this is Sam Evans. I have a question that's posed often. Can you explain, since you've pursued both, a little bit of the differentiation between methodology approach of process and digging into understanding the elements within the code when you do an audit to assess accessibility?
Sure. So there's a lot of different processes for actually assessing website accessibility. Like I said, there's the trusted tester method, which uses a tool called Andy to really dig around in the code. I happen to like Andy a lot because it sections out the different elements of the page. So like you can look at just links or look at just images. And it pulls up the code for you so you don't have to go digging around using inspect or check out the source code, for example, which can be a little overwhelming if you're not used to reading code on a regular basis. So I've gone through a couple of different testing methods, trusted tester, and then I did a lot of training and research to take the CPAC and the WAS. I really liked how focused the WAS was on code. That to me, studying for that gave me a really good idea of how ARIA is supposed to operate with code, even though I'm not seeing it as highly used just because of the way that our systems are coded. So I'd highly recommend checking out one of these methodologies. I think you'll find that the WAS is a little more about information and strategies on how to remediate, where the trusted tester method is very much about how to actually test the site and report issues consistently.
Thank you, Kathryn. I see also another question that's come in through the Q&A. And the question reads, I'd like to ask about why you recommend only using one screen reader when doing testing / not making that a priority. Can you speak more to how the screen readers shift the code? And I think that's, you talked about JAWS. JAWS can render a lot of things because its artificial intelligence is built in to do that versus NVDA or testing to what a novice screen reader uses.
Exactly. And that's why JAWS is so powerful. So I highly recommend it as a screen reader. I just don't recommend it too much for testing because it has such a high level of being able to like take over a screen and reproduce it as something that's more accessible. So it actually like eats the code and then spits it back out as something that's easier for it to interpret. So that's why I recommend using a really not basic screen reader, because NVDA isn't exactly what I call basic, but possibly one that doesn't involve that level of artificial intelligence. I really like recommending NVDA or your systems text-to-speech program, just because that is, to me, what your brand new like novice screen reader user is going to go for. And I want all of our content to be accessible, not just to people who are very experienced screen reader users, but people who are brand new to the idea of a screen reader for whatever reason. So maybe somebody lost their vision later in life, something like that. And they're just starting to navigate this world of screen readers. I still want them to be able to get all of UConn's information. So that's why we design with that in mind. And that's why when we test, we try to use a free screen reader that's not going to have AI capabilities.
And it's really interesting, I think, Kathryn, when you see how JAWS and NVDA differ. JAWS is it's a very powerful tool, but it will parse a lot of content and reorganize it and provide what it intuits as a machine back to the reader so that they don't have to do as much searching. So I think that's probably what you're hitting at. So
yep.
Does that, for our person who asked the question, does that answer your? Hopefully so. Yes, thanks, Kathryn.
Excellent. One thing that I do want to speak to a little bit, just as we're on that topic, is that I didn't really address the question of using people with disabilities as testers. And we've made decisions about that in the past, although I've heard it highly recommended. One thing that I always want to keep in mind is that an individual's disability experience is just that, it's their experience. So for usability testing, it's excellent to involve as many people as you can to go through a site and see if it flows correctly and if it's intuitive. But we really want to check that the code is clean and that the code is accessible before we get into that usability piece. We want to make sure that everything that can be coded accessibly has been already, so that we can check more for how people move through the page and how they get to different elements to see if it's awkward or if it's straightforward, as opposed to having them do the actual, is this accessible testing.
Kathryn, this is Sam. I have another question that I get frequently from people that are curious about what is your biggest surprise that you find in engaging with the people that are creating or delivering the content on campus? What are you discovering with your background in accessibility? What do you discover is the most common unknown?
That's such a good question. The biggest surprise to me has been how willing people are to embrace accessibility. Because I always feel a little bit bad coming in and saying, okay, we're going to overhaul what you're doing currently. And we're going to add this whole new element that you may not know very much about. And people are so gracious about that. They are so passionate about getting information out to as many people as possible. And it's just, they never thought about accessibility, or they thought about it, but they didn't really know how to make those changes. So we have the opportunity for really strong partnerships. The most common issues, honestly, are things like heading levels and making sure those line up correctly, or no alt text or images when it comes to content authors and things like that. When it comes to the developers and designers, sometimes I'll see things that don't receive visual focus when you're using just a keyboard to get to them. Every now and then I'll see something that's not keyboard accessible, but typically we fix that right away. Because that's obviously a huge issue if you can't even get to the element that you're supposed to be able to tab to or use the arrow keys to get to. But I've been really amazed by all the web development and design teams' dedication to accessibility and to doing it as well as they possibly can. So like no one's just trying to tack it on to get a job done. I've been very impressed by the enthusiasm and the level of commitment that I've seen at UConn. And I know that I'm really fortunate in that because not every place has that kind of culture. So, yeah.
Hey, Kathryn, this is Christopher. I have a question.
Sure.
You may have already addressed this. I signed on a little bit late, but in regards to your interaction or the IT department with procurement, specifically around legacy software applications that have been in there a while and that are not accessible. Can you speak to that just briefly about how your connection with procurement?
Absolutely. So we do our best when contracts are coming to the end. We do our best to review the solutions accessibility then. It doesn't always happen. And we don't always get to a review before something is purchased. So I just want to talk about the limitations of the procurement process there, because we're still learning how to fold accessibility into that. That being said, when we do have legacy solutions, I think it becomes really important to determine alternatives to see why this was our solution in the first place, to see if there actually are any alternatives, because in a lot of cases, legacy solutions, at least in my experience, are there because there really isn't anything else that's equivalent. Take like AutoCAD, for example, for engineering. There really isn't an accessible alternative for people who are keyboard users, for example, or people who are screen reader users. And yet that's the industry standard. So while we hope for a solution and we continue to put pressure on vendors for an accessible solution, we also recognize that sometimes exceptions are called for. And if we find that the industry standard is inaccessible, we do our best to find a workaround, but we also know that we need our students to be trained in the industry standard. So it's a very delicate balance of saying, what do our students need in order to be successful? And in a lot of cases that involves our legacy solutions, and also our responsibility to make sure that all of our students can access every solution that we're requiring them to use.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Kathryn, there's another comment that's come in question and answer.
Mm-hmm.
The comment reads, thanks for the overview. What methods have you found effective as a testing plan for websites updated routinely in the level of extensiveness? Another, and add on to that is, in your experience, what models would university accessibility teams or Department of Student Services find suitable to help those seeking experience?
Okay, so I'm thankful I have the question in front of me so I can address the two parts separately. So methods I found effective as a testing plan. Gosh, that's hard because there's so many websites that you actually have to take a look at. And websites are always getting updated, right? That is the blessing and the curse of working in the web accessibility realm. For websites that are updated routinely though, like let's say you're updating every year, like orientation for us updates every single year. We can actually work with that department ahead of time to make sure that before they actually launch their new content or even their new site, for example, that everything is already made as accessible as it possibly can be. We can do some light testing afterwards, but if we know if we know how they're designing the site, if we know how they're building the site, whether it's using Aurora or whether it's using a custom build, we can kind of bake a lot of accessibility into that so that we don't have to test quite as extensively on the user side of things, like after the site has been relaunched. So in my experience, models that help accessibility departments or teams. To help people who are seeking experience. I might not start with something, if they're brand new to this whole idea of ICT accessibility, I definitely wouldn't start off with something that's quite as high geared as like the IAAP certifications or the Trusted Tester program. I would start somewhere like WebAIM because they have such an incredible repository of information. It's all categorized, it's incredibly well organized, and you can read through not only what it is that needs to happen, but why and how we do it. So I really like that as a starting place. And honestly, I Google all the time so that I can find WebAIM articles on whatever I'm looking at. If you are like, you're familiar with IT accessibility, you're trying to like level up your knowledge, then I would definitely recommend doing the CPAC through the IAAP. Because that's just going to broaden your knowledge so much. And to me, it shows how all of it is interconnected. So it kind of hammers home the big ideas about accessibility. If you are looking more for a methodology though, like a testing methodology, definitely check out Trusted Tester. It's free. So it really is available to everyone. And it's an incredibly thorough process. Tests are challenging. I'm not going to pretend like they're not, but just the level of experience that you gain in regards to testing from Trusted Tester, it's incredible. Okay, so I'm seeing another comment that says, you're familiar with accessibility, but from a country with no policies in place, and the DSO needs fundamental information on approach and practice. Definitely go for WebAIM then. You might check out the W3C if you want to kind of get into the weeds a little bit of accessibility. If you are the person spearheading this whole initiative, I would definitely check that out and become as familiar with WCAG as you possibly can be. Kind of sort through the different levels and see which level you're going to target for all of your efforts. So we focus on AA with some AAA thrown in there. But AA is really what we say we're going for and what we practice going for. If people are brand new to this, yeah, I probably wouldn't even throw WCAG at them in its full glory. I would probably take bits and pieces of that and try to train them that way. Think of them like content authors. The low-hanging fruit is going to be the most accessible ideas to them.
Thank you, Kathryn. This is Rachel. Any other questions? I think someone, just a thank you from your last answer.
Rachel, I couldn't hear, are you speaking?
No, I was just waiting here if there any last minute questions came up from our attendees today. We had a lot of great information there. I'm not seeing any more questions. Kathryn, any final thoughts you'd like to share?
Nope, just if you do want to contact me afterwards, my email is kathryn@uconn.edu. And I manage the accessibility.its.uconn.edu website, so you can always go there for more resources. Please feel free to reach out if you have any questions or if you want to talk further about anything.
Okay, thank you, Kathryn. And
Thank you, Kathryn.
We'll make this the webinar today, the recording available, as well as Kathryn's presentation. So if you have any other questions or would like to follow up, you'll have her email in that as well. We hope you'll join us next month. We finish up our series, our year series of this webinar. Our organizational professional development series with unmasking accessibility, moving beyond a Band-Aid solution. We have Pina Diantino and Jennifer Chadwick from Site Improve for that to close out our year, and watch for the 2021 series information to be coming out later this year. And thank you to AI Media for providing our captions today. And thank you so much, Kathryn, for the great information and for your time today.
Thank you, and thank everyone who attended. I really appreciate all of your questions and your input.
All right, thank you, everyone. Have a great rest of your day.